where the secrets of the heart are written with ink and sealed with scandal. Welcome to channel, The Countess Chronicles.
You know what nobody tells you about family? Sometimes the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally are the same ones who'll spend years convincing you that you're unlovable. And here's the really messed up part. You'll believe them. You'll internalize every cruel comment, every comparison, every disappointed sigh until their voice becomes your voice, and you can't tell the difference anymore between their judgment and your own thoughts. I'm about to share a story with you that'll make you question everything you think you know about self-worth. And I'm warning you right now, this isn't some fairy tale where the ugly duckling becomes a swan. This is about a woman who was never ugly in the first place, but spent 19 years being told she was until she almost forgot what the truth looked like. The secret? She didn't need to change. Everyone around her needed to stop being blind. Here's what's wild about this whole thing. Isabella grew up in a noble family, surrounded by wealth and privilege, and she should have had everything. But she didn't have the one thing that actually matters. She didn't have people who saw her. Her family looked at her and saw a problem to be solved, a burden to be managed, a mistake they couldn't quite fix. And when you grow up like that, when the people who are supposed to protect you are actually the ones destroying you, you learn to make yourself small. You learn to apologize for existing. You learn to accept whatever scraps of affection come your way because you've been convinced that's all you deserve. The enigma isn't why she believed their lies. It's how she managed to survive them for so long without completely disappearing. Now, I could tell you this is just a story about a duke who saw past physical appearance to recognize inner beauty, but that would be missing the point entirely. This isn't about him being special or enlightened. This is about a systematic conspiracy of cruelty that lasted nearly 2 decades, and how one woman had to literally unlearn her own worthlessness before she could accept that someone might actually want her. Not despite her flaws, not as a consolation prize, not because they were desperate, but because she was exactly what they'd been looking for all along. And when that truth finally came out, when the mystery of why he chose her got revealed in the most shocking way possible, everything she thought she knew about herself shattered like glass. But here's the twist nobody sees coming. The real villain in this story isn't the family who rejected her. It's the version of herself she became because of them. What you're about to hear will make you angry, legitimately furious, at how normalized emotional abuse can become when it's dressed up as honesty or tough love. You'll recognize patterns you've maybe seen in your own life or in the lives of people you care about. The vestiges of childhood wounds don't just disappear when you become an adult. They follow you, whispering in the background, influencing every decision, every relationship, every moment when you have to choose between making yourself small or taking up space. And the most dangerous part? You won't even realize it's happening. You'll think the voice telling you you're not enough is your own rational assessment, not the echo of people who never should have had that kind of power over you in the first place. But here's why this story matters, and why I need you to stick with me through the painful parts to get to the revelation that changes everything. Isabella's journey isn't just about escaping a toxic family or finding a man who valued her. It's about the excruciating, necessary work of rebuilding yourself from the foundation up, when you realize the person you've been being isn't actually you. It's just a collection of other people's judgments that you've been carrying around like they were facts. And that process, that unlearning, it's not pretty, it's not quick, and it definitely doesn't happen just because someone tells you you're worth more than you think. The hidden truth is that you have to choose to believe it yourself every single day. even when every instinct you've developed over decades is screaming that you're fooling yourself. So if you've ever felt like you're too much or not enough, if you've ever apologized for taking up space, if you've ever wondered why you can't just accept a compliment without immediately deflecting or disbelieving it, this story is for you. If you've ever been the other sibling, the one who didn't quite measure up, the one whose accomplishments got footnoted while someone else's got celebrated, yeah, you're going to see yourself in this, and it's going to hurt. But it's also going to show you something you desperately need to see. That the problem was never you. The problem was the people who convinced you that you were the problem. And once you really understand that, not just intellectually, but in your bones, everything changes. The whole game shifts. Because you stop playing by rules that were designed to keep you losing. This is the story of how Isabella went from being the family embarrassment to becoming a duchess. But more importantly, how she went from believing she was worthless to understanding that she'd always had value. The people around her had just been too blind or too cruel to recognize it. And when her family finally came crawling back, trying to benefit from the success they'd spent years telling her she'd never achieve, that's when the final truth revealed itself. And it was more devastating than any insult they'd ever thrown at her. So buckle up, because we're about to dive into a story about poison and antidotes, about breaking and rebuilding, about losing yourself and finding something better in the wreckage. This is about the conflict between who you're told you are and who you actually are when nobody's watching. And trust me, by the end, you're going to see your own life differently. The question is, are you ready for that? Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. And that might be the most dangerous gift you'll ever receive. It wasn't one moment that broke her, you know? It was the accumulation of 1,000 tiny cuts, each one so small that nobody else would have noticed. But she felt every single one. When you're 12 years old and your cousin gets a brand new dress while you're handed her old one with a casual, "You can wear Sophia's from last year," something shifts inside. It's not about the dress itself, really. It's about what that gesture whispers in the silence of your heart. You're not worth the investment. You're the afterthought, the backup plan, the one who gets what's left over after everyone else has been served. And here's the secret nobody tells you about childhood wounds. They don't scream, they whisper. Every single day. By 15, Isabella had learned to make herself smaller in every possible way. She'd walk into rooms and immediately scan for the darkest corner, the spot where she could disappear into the furniture. Her mother would look at both daughters with this peculiar expression, and then she'd sigh. That long, disappointed exhale that said more than words ever could. "At least one of you pulled the pretty jeans from the family," she'd say, her eyes landing on Sophia like sunlight, then sliding past Isabella like she was a shadow on the wall. The thing is, when your own mother can't hide her disappointment in how you turned out, you start believing there's something fundamentally wrong with your existence. It's not just that you're not pretty enough. It's that you're not enough, period. The vestiges of that belief, they stay buried deep, like codes written in your DNA. Here's what really messed with Isabella's head, though. She started agreeing with them. Seriously. By 17, when her Aunt Marguerite asked her cousin if he had any desperate friends who might take her to the spring festival, Isabella actually felt grateful. Grateful. Can you imagine? She'd internalized the toxicity so completely that she thought, wow, they're still trying to include me, even though I'm like this. She was thanking people for scraps of basic human decency. It's like growing up in a house where all the floors are slanted at 15-degree angles. At first, you notice something's off. You're constantly losing your balance. Nothing feels quite right. But after years of living there, the slant becomes your normal. You start thinking every house is built this way, and maybe you're just bad at walking. The conspiracy of it all was that nobody outside the family ever called it out. Relatives would smile and nod when Aunt Marguerite made those cutting remarks disguised as jokes. Family friends would laugh uncomfortably, but say nothing. Even the servants kept their heads down, though Isabella sometimes caught glimpses of pity in their eyes. That silence? It was its own form of confirmation. If nobody's defending you, if nobody's saying, "Hey, that's messed up," then maybe it really is just you. Maybe you really are the problem everyone's too polite to name directly. The enigma wasn't why they treated her this way. She'd accepted that as deserved. The enigma was why she kept hoping it would change. By 19, Isabella had perfected the art of apologizing for existing. She'd say sorry for speaking too loudly, for taking up space at the dinner table, for breathing too heavily after climbing stairs. She became fluent in the language of self-erasure, and honestly, she got really good at it. When someone asked her what she wanted, she'd freeze, not because she was being difficult, but because she genuinely couldn't access that information anymore. Her wants had been locked away in some hidden chamber of her psyche, buried under years of being told they didn't matter. Think about it. When was the last time you asked for something you truly wanted, without immediately following it up with, "But it's fine if not," or "I don't really need it"? Yeah, that's the poison working. The really insidious part about this kind of treatment is how it becomes predictive. Isabella started rejecting herself before anyone else could. Some guy would glance in her direction at a gathering. She'd immediately look away, certain he'd made a mistake. Someone would compliment her. She'd deflect so hard she'd practically throw the kindness back in their face. It's like when you expect disappointment so deeply that you start creating it yourself, just to maintain the familiar pain. At least when you're in control of your own rejection, there's no surprise, no fresh wound. The old scars are easier to live with than new ones, or so the logic goes. But that's not living. That's just surviving in increasingly creative ways. Now, here's where most people get it wrong when they hear stories like this. They think the solution is just confidence, or self-love, or whatever buzzword is trending this week. But you can't just decide to unlearn 19 years of conditioning overnight. Isabella didn't wake up one morning and think, "You know what? I'm just gonna love myself now." That's not how it works. The damage had layers, every year adding another coat of paint over the original crime until you can't even see what the wall looked like before. And every time she tried to scratch through to something authentic underneath, she'd hit another layer of hurt, another memory of being diminished, another piece of evidence that confirmed her worst fears about herself. What makes this whole thing even more tragic is that Isabella was never actually the problem. She was intelligent, brilliant with numbers, actually. She'd spend hours helping the estate accountant, catching errors nobody else noticed. She was kind, genuinely kind, not the performative kind that people use to gain favor. She'd sneak food to the servants' children, teach the stable boy to read when nobody was watching. She had dreams, too. Opening a school for children who couldn't afford education, studying astronomy, contributing something meaningful to the world. But here's the thing about being constantly told you're not enough. Eventually, you start hiding the parts of yourself that are enough, because they create this painful conflict with the narrative you've been sold. So she buried all of it, every trace of her real self, and prepared to live as the family disappointment forever. And then came the wedding announcement, and everything she thought she knew about her life? Yeah, that was about to shatter completely, though not in any way she could have predicted. The mystery of who she'd actually been forced to marry was about to reveal something far more complex than she ever imagined. 2 months after her 19th birthday, Isabella's father summoned her to the drawing room. The entire family was already gathered there, her mother perched on the settee, Sophia preening by the window, Aunt Marguerite holding court near the fireplace. Isabella's first thought wasn't excitement or curiosity. It was dread. That familiar knot in her stomach that always appeared when she became the center of attention. Because attention in her family never meant anything good. She walked in slowly, her eyes already searching for the safest corner to occupy. And then her father cleared his throat with that particular tone that meant an announcement was coming. "Isabella," he said, not even looking at her directly, "you're to be married. Duke Nathaniel of the Northern Territories has agreed to the union." And that's when something truly bizarre happened. Everyone started celebrating. Not with her. Around her, the room erupted in a way Isabella had never experienced before. Sophia clapped her hands together, practically bouncing with what looked like relief. Her mother actually smiled, though the expression didn't quite reach Isabella's direction. Aunt Marguerite raised her glass of afternoon sherry and declared it wonderful news, and several cousins who'd barely acknowledged Isabella's existence before suddenly wanted to embrace her. But here's what made the whole scene feel like a fever dream. Nobody was looking at her. Nobody asked if she was happy, scared, or even surprised. They were celebrating around her like she was a piece of furniture they'd finally managed to sell. The conflict between what should have been happening and what was actually happening created this surreal disconnect. Shouldn't someone ask the bride how she feels? Apparently not, when you're the family's unwanted burden finally being shipped off. Then Aunt Marguerite approached with that smile. You know the one, where someone's mouth curves up but their eyes stay cold and calculating. "See, Isabella, I told you we'd find someone for you eventually." She said it like she was doing charity work, like Isabella should be lighting candles in gratitude. Of course, we had to look in certain, shall we say, less conventional circles. The Duke isn't exactly known for being particular about appearances, if you understand my meaning. The implication hung in the air like smoke. They'd found someone desperate enough, someone damaged enough, someone with low enough standards to accept what the family considered defective merchandise. And they expected her to thank them for it. The secret everyone was dancing around was painfully obvious. This wasn't a marriage. It was a disposal. Isabella knew the stories about Duke Nathaniel. Everyone did. The whispers had traveled through the social circles like wildfire wrapped in silk. They called him the Beast of the North, not affectionately, but with that mix of fear and fascination that people reserve for things they don't understand. The rumors painted a picture that would have terrified anyone. A man hideously scarred from some mysterious conflict in the borderlands, so disfigured that he rarely left his castle. They said his temperament matched his appearance. Brutal, cold, impossible to please. Some claimed he'd driven away 3 potential brides before Isabella, each one taking one look at him and fleeing in the night. The most persistent rumor? That he was so desperate for an heir to continue his bloodline that he'd finally agreed to accept any bride, regardless of anything. Quality didn't matter anymore. He just needed a body willing to stay. Sitting in her room that night, Isabella tried to process what her life had become. She wasn't sad, exactly. You can't mourn losing something you never really had, and she'd never had her family's love or approval anyway. But there was this hollow feeling in her chest, like someone had scooped out everything that made her human and left just the shell behind. "I'm so ugly," she thought, staring at her reflection in the vanity mirror, that my own family is marrying me off to a monster, and they think they're doing me a favor. It's wild how cruelty can disguise itself as kindness, isn't it? They'd wrapped this whole transaction up in ribbons and celebration, acting like they'd secured her future, when really they were just getting rid of her. Like those old pieces of furniture people leave on the curb with a sign that says, "Free, please take." That was Isabella. Free to whoever would haul her away. The week leading up to the wedding passed in this strange, dreamlike haze. Isabella barely slept, her mind churning with increasingly dark scenarios. She'd imagine arriving at this decrepit castle, all shadows and silence, and being greeted by a figure so horrifying that she'd have to train herself not to flinch. She pictured him looking at her with disgust. Even a monster had standards, right? And thinking, this is what they sent me? This is the best they could do? The enigma that kept her awake wasn't what he'd do to her. It was how he'd react to her. Would he be angry that even in his desperation, he'd been stuck with the family reject? Would he see her the same way her family did, as something hidden, better kept from polite society? But here's what nobody tells you about rock bottom. Sometimes there's a strange kind of freedom in it. When you've already accepted the worst possible outcome, when you've convinced yourself that you're heading toward a nightmare you can't escape, there's nothing left to lose. Isabella spent that final night before the wedding not crying or praying or hoping for a miracle. She spent it numbly accepting her fate, building walls around whatever small piece of herself she had left. She'd be a wife in name, fulfill whatever duties were required, and exist in whatever shadowy corner of that northern castle they'd allow her. It wasn't living, but she'd never really been alive anyway. Not in any way that counted. The disappearance of hope is sometimes less painful than hoping and being disappointed again. The morning of the journey north, Isabella's mother helped her dress, not tenderly, but efficiently, like preparing a package for shipment. "You'll do fine," she said, not meeting Isabella's eyes in the mirror. "Just be agreeable. Don't cause problems. Remember that this is more than you could have hoped for." More than she could have hoped for. Those words sat heavy in Isabella's stomach as the carriage pulled away from the only home she'd ever known. Through the window, she watched her family waving goodbye with expressions of relief rather than sadness. Sophia was already talking animatedly with their mother, probably planning how to redecorate Isabella's old room. And as the carriage rolled farther into unknown territory, Isabella felt something shift inside her. She was heading toward a man they'd called a beast, a marriage built on mutual desperation, a life in a castle everyone described with dread. But when the Northern Territory's dark forests finally appeared on the horizon, when the imposing stone towers of the Duke's residence came into view, when the carriage finally stopped, and a servant opened her door, that's when Isabella discovered that everything she'd been told was a lie. Because the man waiting at the top of those castle steps, he wasn't a monster at all. In fact, he was the most devastatingly handsome man she'd ever seen in her entire life. And somehow, that revelation was even more terrifying than any scar could have been. The carriage door opened, and Isabella's heart hammered so violently she thought it might crack her ribs. She'd prepared herself for horror, for revulsion, for that moment when she'd have to school her features into something resembling acceptance, while her insides screamed. She stepped down carefully, keeping her eyes on the ground like she'd been trained to do, and then, because you can't avoid looking at your future forever, she glanced up, and everything she thought she knew shattered like glass hitting stone. There was a man at the top of the entrance steps, and he was perfect. Not handsome in a conventional way, but in that rare, almost unsettling way where every feature seemed deliberately crafted. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the kind of confidence that comes from never having to question your place in the world. And his face, God, his face. No scars, no deformities, just sharp jawline, intense dark eyes, and features that belonged in a portrait gallery, not in the nightmare scenario she'd been sold. Isabella's brain short-circuited. This had to be a mistake, right? Maybe this was the Duke's brother, or a visiting lord, or literally anyone except the man she was supposed to marry. Because the rumors had been so specific, so detailed, so universally agreed upon. Everyone knew about the Beast of the North. Everyone whispered about his monstrous appearance. But the man descending those steps with measured grace looked like he'd stepped out of a romantic epic, not a cautionary tale. And that's when the real panic set in. Not the fear she'd expected, but something worse. If he looked like this, what would he think when he really looked at her? Her family had compared her to Sophia her entire life and found her lacking. What would someone this striking think of the plain, awkward girl they'd essentially dumped on his doorstep? The secret she'd carried all her life, that she was somehow fundamentally unworthy, suddenly felt more true than ever. Her first instinct was to disappear, which was impossible, but that didn't stop her body from trying. She lowered her gaze immediately, staring at the cobblestones like they held the secrets of the universe. Her shoulders curled inward, making herself smaller, less noticeable, less there. And Aunt Marguerite's voice started playing in her head like a curse she couldn't silence. "Look at you. Look at him. You really think you deserve this? You think you're enough for someone like that?" The internal conspiracy against herself was so immediate, so automatic, that she didn't even question it. Of course, she wasn't enough. She'd never been enough. And now she'd have to endure a lifetime of watching this impossibly attractive man realize what a poor bargain he'd made. Watching disappointment settle into his features the way it had in everyone else's. But then he spoke, and his voice wasn't what she expected either. It was warm, surprisingly gentle, with an undertone of something that sounded almost like anticipation? "Lady Isabella?" He'd reached the bottom of the steps now, standing close enough that she could see the details. The way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, the hint of a smile playing at his lips. He extended his hand toward her, palm up, waiting. "I'm Nathaniel. It's truly a pleasure to finally meet you." And here's the thing that made her head spin. The emphasis he put on that word. You. Like she was someone specific he'd been waiting for, not just any warm body to fulfill a contract. Like her arrival meant something beyond mere obligation. Nobody had ever said her name like that before. Like it was worth the breath it took to speak it. That first dinner was its own special kind of torture, but not for the reasons Isabella had anticipated. They sat across from each other in a dining room that was surprisingly cozy for a castle. Warm lighting, comfortable chairs, none of the cold grandeur she'd expected. And Nathaniel asked her questions. Actual questions. What do you enjoy doing when you have free time? What subjects fascinate you? Tell me about something that makes you genuinely happy. Isabella kept waiting for the catch, for the moment when he'd lose interest or reveal this was all some elaborate joke. Because these weren't questions anyone had ever asked her before. In her family, questions were always about Sophia. Sophia's interests, Sophia's accomplishments, Sophia's dreams. Isabella had been the silent shadow, the one who existed to make Sophia shine brighter by comparison. And now this man, this duke, who looked like a fantasy and supposedly needed a wife so desperately he'd accept anyone, was sitting there acting like her answers actually mattered? Her suspicious mind wouldn't let her accept it at face value. He's being kind out of pity, she thought, picking at her food without tasting it. Or obligation. This is what noble people do. They're polite even when they're disappointed. She gave short, careful answers, afraid that if she revealed too much, he'd see what her family saw. The defects, the inadequacy, the fundamental wrongness that made her unlovable. But Nathaniel didn't push or pry. He just listened with this focused attention that made her skin feel too tight, like she was being seen in a way she'd never experienced before. And then, right when Isabella was convinced this was all a performance he'd eventually tire of, he said something that cracked the foundation of everything she believed about herself. "Isabella, I want you to understand something." He set down his wine glass, and his expression turned serious in a way that demanded attention. "I chose this marriage, not because I was forced, not because I was desperate, and definitely not because I'm settling for whatever I could get." He leaned forward slightly, holding her gaze, even though she wanted desperately to look away. "When your family's intermediary described you to me, not your appearance, but you, your character, your interests, the person you are, I wanted to meet you. That's why I agreed to this union. Because something about who you are intrigued me in a way that 100 beautiful faces never have." The revelation in his words should have been comforting, but instead it felt like being handed oxygen after years of suffocation. Disorienting, almost painful, too much too fast. It's like when you've been living in darkness for so long that sudden light actually hurts your eyes. You almost prefer the shadows, because at least they're familiar. At least you know how to navigate them. Isabella had built her entire identity around being unwanted. And here was this man, this inexplicably perfect man, telling her she'd been chosen deliberately. Not as a last resort, not as charity, but as a preference. The enigma of it all made her head spin. How could her family's version of reality and his version exist simultaneously? One of them had to be lying, and she'd spent 19 years learning to trust her family's assessment of her worth, or rather, her worthlessness. But looking at Nathaniel's face, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, feeling the weight of his attention, maybe, just maybe, the lie wasn't coming from him. Maybe the poison had been in the well all along, and she'd been drinking from it so long she'd forgotten what clean water tasted like. Still, 1 week of kindness couldn't erase 2 decades of cruelty. The vestiges of her old beliefs clung tight, whispering that this was too good to be true, that the other shoe would drop eventually, that she should protect herself before the inevitable disappointment arrived. And that's exactly what she did. She built walls, high ones, thick ones, walls designed to keep out exactly the kind of hope that Nathaniel was offering. Because hope, she'd learned, was just another word for pain. But those walls, they were about to become her biggest problem. And the conflict wasn't going to come from him. It was going to come from the war she was waging against herself. Here's what nobody warns you about when you've been broken for long enough. You become your own prison guard. Nathaniel would do something kind, and Isabella's brain would immediately translate it into pity. He'd compliment her, and she'd hear it as polite lying. He'd suggest spending time together, and she'd invent elaborate excuses to avoid it. It wasn't him. It was never him. It was the conspiracy she'd been running against herself for so long that it had become automatic, like breathing. When he invited her for a morning ride through the estate, she claimed she didn't know how to ride horses. Complete lie, she'd been riding since she was 8. When he wanted to show her his personal library, this massive collection that would have made her heart sing under different circumstances, She suddenly felt too tired. When he asked if she'd enjoyed dinner, she'd shrug and say it was fine, even though the food had been incredible, and the conversation even better. Why? Because she was terrified. Not of him, but of the moment when he'd finally see her clearly and realize what everyone else had already concluded, that she wasn't worth the effort. Better to keep him at arm's length, to maintain the emotional distance, to never let him get close enough to discover all the ways she was lacking. It's like when you're holding something fragile, and you know you're going to drop it eventually. So you just put it down yourself. Control the brake before it controls you. Every time Nathaniel tried to build a bridge, Isabella burned it from her side. And the crazy part? She thought she was protecting herself. She thought she was being smart, strategic, realistic. In reality, she was just doing her family's job for them, keeping herself small and hidden and unloved. Except now she didn't even need them to do it anymore. She'd internalized their voices so completely that they lived rent-free in her head, narrating her every move. 2 weeks into the marriage, Nathaniel finally cornered her. Not physically, he'd never do that, but emotionally. He asked her to meet him in the drawing room, and his tone made it clear this wasn't optional. When she arrived, he was standing by the window, and he turned to face her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Isabella, we need to talk," he said, and those 4 words made her stomach drop. Here it comes, she thought. The rejection, the disappointment. The moment when he admits this was all a mistake. But what he said instead caught her completely off guard. "You're here, but you're not here. Every time I try to get closer, you run. Every time I extend an invitation, you deflect. What did I do wrong? Tell me so I can fix it." And the genuine confusion in his voice, the hurt lurking beneath the surface, it broke something loose inside her. She exploded. Not with anger at him, but with all the rage and pain and self-hatred she'd been carrying for 19 years. "Nothing!" The word came out like a sob. "You didn't do anything. You're perfect, and I don't understand why you haven't sent me back yet. Have you looked at me? Really looked? I'm exactly what my family said I was, and you're..." She couldn't finish. The words got stuck somewhere between her chest and her throat. And then she was crying. Actually crying. Not the silent tears she'd learned to hide, but full, ugly sobs that shook her entire body. She collapsed into a chair, hands covering her face, and for the first time since arriving at the castle, she let someone see her completely fall apart. The secret she'd been guarding so carefully, that she believed herself worthless, was now out in the open, exposed like a raw wound. Nathaniel didn't speak for what felt like an eternity. He just watched her, and Isabella couldn't tell if his silence meant disgust, or pity, or regret. Finally, when her sobs had quieted to hiccups, he moved closer and knelt down so they were at eye level. "I have looked," he said quietly, and his voice was so gentle it almost hurt. "From the very first moment. And you want to know what I saw? Someone trying to vanish. Someone apologizing for breathing. Someone who's been convinced, thoroughly, systematically convinced, that they don't deserve to take up space in the world." He paused, and when he spoke again, there was steel beneath the softness. "Isabella, who did this to you? Who made you believe you were less than human? Because it wasn't me, and it wasn't anyone in this castle. This came from before, and that's when everything came pouring out." She told him about the comparisons with Sophia that started before she could even understand what they meant. About Aunt Marguerite's casual cruelty dressed up as concern. About her mother's size and her father's indifference and the birthday when she turned 16 and nobody remembered because Sophia had just gotten engaged. She told him about the years of being treated like a burden, a mistake, a problem that needed solving. About how they'd celebrated her wedding like they were finally getting rid of defective furniture. And most painfully, she confessed that she'd believed every word, that she'd agreed with their assessment, that when they told her he must be desperate to accept someone like her, she'd thought, yeah, that makes sense. The hidden shame she'd carried for so long was finally visible, and she couldn't take it back. Nathaniel listened to all of it without interrupting, and his expression shifted from confusion to understanding to something that looked almost like fury, but not at her. When she finally went quiet, exhausted from the confession, he stood up and walked to his desk. "I want to show you something," he said, pulling out a letter from a locked drawer. He handed it to her carefully, like it was precious. The paper was thick, expensive, and the date at the top made her pause. 6 months before the wedding proposal. 6 months before her father had announced the arrangement. She started reading, and with each line, her understanding of reality shifted again. It was a letter from Nathaniel to her father, formally requesting consideration for a marriage union. But it wasn't what she expected. The words on that page rewrote everything. "I've heard from multiple reliable sources about your younger daughter," Nathaniel had written. "Her aptitude for mathematics and estate management, her dedication to education despite limited encouragement, her kindness toward those less fortunate. These are qualities I deeply admire and actively seek in a life partner. I would be honored to meet Lady Isabella with matrimonial intentions, should you deem this appropriate." Isabella read it 3 times, looking for the catch, for the mention of her appearance or some desperate plea. But there was nothing. He'd asked for her specifically, deliberately, based on who she was, not what she looked like or what political advantage she offered. The mystery of his choice was solving itself in the most unexpected way. He'd actually wanted her, not as a consolation prize, but as a first choice. "The rumors about me," Nathaniel said, watching her face as she processed the letter, "about my appearance, my desperation, my supposed monstrousness. I started them. Deliberately." Isabella looked up, confused, and he continued, "I wanted a wife who would see me as a person, not a title or a treasury or a social advantage. I wanted someone who'd marry me despite thinking I was damaged, because that meant they had reasons beyond the superficial. I spread those stories to filter out everyone who only cared about status or looks or power." He smiled, but it was tinged with something sad. "Your family took the bait perfectly. They thought they were dumping their defective daughter on a desperate monster. What they actually did was send me exactly the woman I'd been hoping to find. Someone real, someone kind, someone who understood what it meant to be judged unfairly." The revelation hung between them like a bridge finally connecting 2 isolated islands. Isabella had been reading the map upside down her entire life, and someone had just turned it right side up. The territory looked completely different from this angle. She wasn't the unwanted one. She'd been chosen, specifically, intentionally, by someone who'd gone to elaborate lengths to find exactly her. And somehow, that truth was both liberating and absolutely terrifying. Because now, she had to figure out who she actually was when she wasn't busy being the person her family had told her she was. That journey. It was about to get complicated. 2 months into the marriage, Nathaniel suggested something that made Isabella's blood run cold: visiting her family. "I think it would be good," he said over breakfast, completely casual, like he wasn't proposing they walk straight into enemy territory. "Let them see how you're doing, how happy we are." Isabella's stomach twisted itself into knots. Part of her, that wounded child, part that never quite heals, desperately wanted them to see her differently, wanted them to witness that someone valued her, that she wasn't the family embarrassment anymore, that she'd somehow managed to become a duchess when they'd expected her to just disappear quietly. But another part, the part that had learned hard lessons about hope, knew better. They wouldn't see her differently. They'd just find new ways to diminish her, new codes of cruelty to crack her open with. Still, she heard herself agreeing, because apparently self-preservation isn't as strong as the need for parental approval, even when your parents have never actually approved of anything about you. The journey back felt like traveling toward an execution. Isabella couldn't eat, couldn't sleep properly, kept running through scenarios in her mind. Would they be impressed, jealous, or would they just find new ammunition, new ways to remind her that she didn't deserve this? When their carriage finally pulled up to the family estate, the entire household was gathered outside. Her parents, Sophia, Aunt Marguerite, various cousins and relatives she barely remembered. They looked prosperous and polished, like a portrait of aristocratic perfection. And for a split second, Isabella felt 12 years old again, small and inadequate and wrong. Then Aunt Marguerite's voice cut through the air, sugar-sweet and poisonous. "Isabella, darling, my goodness, married life hasn't done much for your figure, has it? You look well-fed." She laughed, that tinkling sound that was supposed to make cruelty sound like concern. Nathaniel's hand tightened around Isabella's, and she felt him go very still beside her. The first shot had been fired. They organized a dinner that evening, a grand affair with extended family and local nobles, all gathered ostensibly to celebrate Isabella's marriage, but really to scrutinize it like a curiosity in a museum. Sophia was there in a stunning gown, working the room like she always did, collecting admirers like some people collect coins. Isabella sat at the table feeling like an imposter in expensive clothes, waiting for someone to point out that she didn't belong here in this dress, with this man, in this life. And then Aunt Marguerite stood up to make a toast, and Isabella knew, just knew, that whatever came next was going to hurt. "To the Duke and Duchess," Marguerite announced, raising her glass with theatrical flair. "What a joy to have the Duke here with us, especially considering the unique circumstances of his marriage." Polite laughter rippled around the table, the kind that has sharp edges hidden in it. Nathaniel maintained perfect composure, his face neutral, but Isabella could feel the tension radiating off him like heat. Aunt Marguerite wasn't finished, though. She never was. "You know, Duke Nathaniel, we were all so surprised when we heard you'd accepted Isabella's hand." She paused for effect, and the room went quiet, everyone leaning in like they were watching a play. "We'd imagined that a man of your caliber would have more, how shall I put this, delicately, presentable options available?" The word hung in the air like a slap. Presentable. As in, Isabella wasn't. As in, he'd settled. As in, everyone here knew it, and now they were just saying it out loud. Total silence descended on the dining room. Isabella wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. Her mother studied her plate. Her father coughed awkwardly. Sophia smiled behind her wine glass, clearly enjoying the show. And Isabella felt herself shrinking again, becoming that small, unwanted thing she'd been her entire childhood. Then Nathaniel moved, and it was like watching a master strategist deploy his forces. He set his fork down slowly, deliberately, the soft clink of metal on porcelain somehow louder than it should have been. He turned to face Aunt Marguerite directly, and his expression was perfectly polite, perfectly controlled, and absolutely devastating. Presentable options, he repeated, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. What an interesting phrase, Lady Marguerite. You're quite right about one thing. I did have options. Dozens of them, actually. He paused, and Isabella could see Marguerite's triumphant smile beginning to form, like she'd just confirmed her point. But Nathaniel wasn't done. Not even close. Families begging for alliances, women who were beautiful, well-connected, accomplished in all the traditional ways. My correspondence secretary had to hire additional staff just to manage all the proposals. The smile on Marguerite's face was full-blown now, vindicated. See, her expression said, even he admits it. And I refused every single one, Nathaniel continued, his tone sharpening just slightly. Do you know why? The question hung there, rhetorical, but somehow demanding an answer anyway. Nobody spoke. Because beauty? I see it every day at court. It's tedious, it's shallow, it's common. Any woman can be beautiful with the right dress and enough powder. He shifted his gaze around the table, making eye contact with several guests before landing back on Marguerite. Isabella is the only woman I encountered in months of careful searching who, when I asked about her dreams, didn't say, marry someone wealthy and powerful. She told me she wanted to open a school for children who couldn't afford education, that she wanted to study the stars, to understand astronomy and mathematics, that she wanted her life to mean something beyond her appearance or her connections. The revelation in his words was changing the atmosphere in the room, shifting the power dynamic in real time. Nathaniel turned to Isabella then, reaching for her hand across the table, and his expression softened in a way that made her chest ache. She's the only person who, when she first saw me, didn't immediately try to impress me or manipulate me or perform for me. She just existed, honestly, without artifice. He raised her hand to his lips briefly, a gesture so tender and genuine that several women at the table actually gasped softly. Then he turned back to face the room, his voice taking on an edge that could cut glass. And regarding presentable, Isabella is the most stunning woman I've ever known. Not because she fits into some ridiculous, arbitrary standard of beauty that changes with fashion and fades with age, but because, when she smiles, really smiles, which is rare thanks to how you've all treated her, she lights up everything around her. Her intelligence is breathtaking. Her kindness is profound. Her strength, after surviving this family, is nothing short of heroic. So yes, Lady Marguerite, Nathaniel said, his tone absolutely final. I chose Isabella. Deliberately. Specifically. And I would make the same choice 1,000 times over, because she's not just presentable, she's exceptional. The tragedy isn't that I married her. The tragedy is that all of you had 19 years to see what I saw in weeks, and you were too blind, too cruel, or too invested in your own egos to look. The silence that followed was deafening. Isabella was crying. She couldn't help it. But not from shame this time. From something else. Liberation, maybe. Or vindication. Or just the sheer shock of having someone defend her existence like it was worth defending. Because for the first time in her entire life, someone had stood up and said, no, actually, she matters, in a room full of people who'd spent years insisting she didn't. Aunt Marguerite's face had gone scarlet, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Her mother was staring at nothing, suddenly fascinated by the wallpaper pattern. Sophia, for once in her life, didn't look beautiful. She looked small and mean and exposed. The other guests were whispering to each other, but the energy had shifted entirely. They weren't looking at Isabella with pity anymore. They were looking at her with something closer to respect, or at least reconsideration. And they were looking at her family with something that resembled disgust. The conspiracy of silence that had protected her family's cruelty for so long had just been shattered in the most public way possible. It's like carrying a massive weight on your back for so long that you forget it's there, and then someone lifts it off and you almost fall forward from the sudden lightness. Isabella had forgotten what it felt like to exist without carrying her family's hatred. And now, sitting in that dining room with Nathaniel's hand still holding hers, she remembered. She remembered what it felt like to breathe. After that dinner, everything changed. But not in the way you might think. Because the real change wasn't in how her family saw her. Honestly, she was starting to realize their opinion didn't matter as much as she'd thought. The real change was happening inside her, in all those hidden places where the poison had been living for years. And that internal shift? That was about to become the hardest battle she'd ever fight. Because sometimes, the cruelest enemy is the one you've been carrying in your own mind all along. They returned to the castle, and Isabella expected to feel something triumphant, maybe, victorious, like she'd finally won some long-fought battle against the people who'd hurt her. But instead, she just felt empty, hollow. For 19 years, she'd defined herself entirely through her family's eyes. Their disappointment was her identity. Their rejection was her reality. Their cruelty was her measuring stick. And now? They'd been publicly proven wrong. So if she wasn't the worthless, ugly burden they'd always said she was, then who was she? It's terrifying, honestly, to realize you've built your entire sense of self on a foundation of lies. When that foundation cracks, you don't just lose the bad stuff, you lose everything, because you have no idea what's real anymore. She'd spent so long being the unwanted daughter that she'd never bothered to figure out who Isabella actually was underneath all that damage. One evening, maybe a week after their return, Isabella finally voiced the question that had been eating at her. They were in the library, Nathaniel reading correspondence, Isabella pretending to read, but mostly just staring at the same page. "Why do you see me differently?" she asked suddenly, and he looked up, surprised by the interruption. "What do you see that they never did?" It came out more desperate than she'd intended, almost pleading. Nathaniel set down his papers slowly, giving her his full attention, and his answer was so simple it almost hurt. "I don't see you differently, Isabella. I see you. Actually, see you. They never looked. There's a difference." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, holding her gaze. "You've spent your entire life thinking you need to prove you deserve to exist, to prove you're worthy of space, of attention, of love. But here's the secret they never told you. You don't need to prove anything. You already are enough. You always were." The process of unlearning 19 years of poison wasn't a single moment of revelation. It was daily, exhausting work that felt like trying to rewrite your own programming while the old code kept running in the background. Nathaniel helped, not by fixing her, because she wasn't broken, just damaged, but by creating an environment where she could start examining the lies she'd internalized. First up, the constant apologizing. Isabella said sorry for everything, for speaking, for existing, for breathing too loudly when she climbed stairs. So Nathaniel created a game, and it was torture. Every time she apologized unnecessarily, she had to immediately follow it with something she genuinely liked about herself. "Sorry for interrupting. Now say something good." And she'd freeze, completely blank. In those early days, she couldn't think of a single thing, not one positive quality. The hidden shame had buried everything good so deep she couldn't access it anymore. Next came the wardrobe situation, and honestly, this one surprised her. Isabella had spent years wearing dark, oversized clothes designed to make her disappear, to take up less visual space, to avoid drawing attention. One morning, Nathaniel asked her a question nobody had ever posed before. What do you actually like wearing? Not what hides you best or makes you smallest. What makes you feel good? And Isabella realized with a jolt that she had no idea. She'd never thought about what she liked, only about what made her less noticeable. So she started experimenting, tentatively at first. A dress in deep emerald that made her feel regal instead of invisible. A riding outfit in rich burgundy that actually fit her properly. Colors and fabrics chosen because they pleased her, not because they camouflaged her existence. It sounds superficial, but it wasn't. Every choice to wear something she actually wanted was an act of rebellion against years of enforced self-erasure. Then came the spatial issue, and this one was brutal. Nathaniel insisted Isabella sit at the head of the table during meals, the Duchess's traditional position. She hated it. Absolutely hated it. Too exposed, too visible, too much attention. She wanted to sink into the chair and disappear, to make herself small like she'd always done. But Nathaniel was gentle and relentless. You're the Duchess. This is your place. Not because I'm being generous, but because it's your right. It's not a favor. It's a fact. It took weeks before she could sit there without her shoulders hunching inward, without that voice in her head screaming that she was taking up too much space. The vestiges of her old training were stubborn, clinging like barnacles to a ship. But slowly, painfully, she started to believe that maybe she did belong in that chair. Maybe she did deserve to be seen. The worst part, though, was unlearning the belief that love was something you earned through perfect behavior. Isabella tested Nathaniel constantly, not consciously at first, but compulsively. She'd be difficult just to see if he'd leave. She'd say something harsh to check if he'd stop being kind. She'd push boundaries to find the breaking point, because everyone had a breaking point, and she wanted to locate his before she got too attached. One evening, after she'd been particularly prickly for no reason, Nathaniel finally called her out. Isabella, you can have bad days. You can be cranky, make mistakes, say the wrong thing. I'm not going to disappear. This isn't a performance you need to maintain to keep me around. That's not how this works. You don't earn love. You just receive it. Or you don't. But either way, it's not a transaction. The enigma of unconditional acceptance was so foreign to her that she almost couldn't process it. Reconstructing yourself after that kind of damage is like cleaning out a house that's been infested with termites for decades. From the outside, everything might look stable. But when you start pulling back the walls, you discover the structural damage goes way deeper than you thought. The foundation itself is compromised. You can't just paint over it or patch a few holes. You have to rebuild from the ground up, and that's slow, painful, necessary work. There were nights Isabella woke up in a cold sweat, convinced that Nathaniel would wake up the next morning and finally see what everyone else had always seen, that she was fundamentally defective. There were days she'd look in the mirror and hear Aunt Marguerite's voice like it was standing right behind her. Ugly. Worthless. Why would anyone want you? The old codes were deeply embedded, and they didn't disappear just because the circumstances changed. But here's what started to shift things. Nathaniel's consistency. Not his grand gestures or his public declarations, but the quiet, daily presence. When Isabella had those middle-of-the-night panic attacks, he didn't demand explanations or get frustrated. He just sat beside her in the darkness, solid and steady, until her breathing calmed. When she caught herself in those spirals of self-hatred, he didn't try to argue her out of it with logic. He just stayed. Present. Reliable. Proving through action, not words, that her worth wasn't conditional on her perfection. And slowly, painfully slowly, something began to heal. 6 months after that disastrous family dinner, they were in the library again. Isabella was reading, actually relaxed for once, curled up in her favorite chair with afternoon light streaming through the windows. Nathaniel looked up from his work and said, almost casual, "You're beautiful like this." And Isabella's automatic response started forming, "You don't have to lie." But she caught herself, stopped, and instead asked, "Why? Why do you think that?" "Because you're doing something you love," he answered simply. "Because you're relaxed. Because right now, you're not performing or hiding or apologizing. You're just you. Just Isabella, without all the armor and defenses. And that version, that's the most stunning thing I've ever seen." And for the first time, the very first time in her entire life, Isabella believed it. Not because he said it, but because she felt it. Something had shifted inside her. Some fundamental recalibration of how she understood herself. The mystery of her own worth was starting to solve itself, not through external validation, but through internal recognition. She was beginning to see what he saw, and more importantly, she was beginning to trust her own perception instead of defaulting to her family's poisonous narrative. It felt like learning to breathe properly after years of shallow, panicked gasps. It felt like coming home to a self she'd never been allowed to meet. But the story doesn't end there, because 6 months after that library moment, Isabella's family had the audacity to reappear. They sent a letter requesting another visit, citing urgent family matters. And that's when the final truth, the last piece of this whole twisted puzzle, became impossible to ignore. Because sometimes, the people who break you don't learn their lesson from losing you. Sometimes they just recalculate your value based on what you can do for them now. And when they showed up at the castle gates, smiling and false and desperate in ways they tried to hide, Isabella finally understood the complete picture of who they'd always been. And more importantly, who she'd always been despite them. That final confrontation was coming. And this time she was ready for it. Because she finally knew something they'd never wanted her to learn. Her worth wasn't determined by whether they could see it. It existed independent of their blindness. And that realization? That was the most dangerous thing she could have possibly discovered. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, sealed with her father's crest and written in his characteristically formal hand. "Urgent family matters require discussion," it read. "We request permission to visit at your earliest convenience." Nathaniel brought it to Isabella over breakfast, and his expression was carefully neutral. "Do you want them to come?" he asked, giving her the choice, which was its own small revolution. Nobody had ever asked what she wanted before. Isabella stared at that letter for a long time, feeling two opposing forces war inside her. Part of her, that wounded child who never quite grows up, still wanted their approval, still hoped that maybe, finally, they'd see her differently, that they'd acknowledge the hurt they'd caused, maybe even apologize. But the other part, the part that had been slowly healing over these past months, was angry. Furious, actually. Because they only wanted to visit now. Now that she was a duchess. Now that she had power and access and resources. Where had they been when she was nobody? They arrived 3 days later, all of them. Her parents, Sophia, Aunt Marguerite, even a few cousins she barely remembered. And the transformation in their behavior was almost comical, if it wasn't so insulting. Aunt Marguerite, who'd called her ugly and worthless for 19 years, swept into the castle with arms wide open. "Isabella, darling, Look at you. Marriage has done wonders. You're absolutely glowing." The same woman who'd mocked her weight at the last visit was now gushing about how healthy and vibrant she looked. Isabella hadn't changed, not physically. Same face, same body, same person. The only difference was the title attached to her name and the castle surrounding her. It was like watching people interact with a completely different person. And in a way, they were. They'd never actually seen Isabella. They were seeing Duchess Isabella, and apparently she was worth their attention in ways that plain Isabella never had been. For 2 days, Isabella endured their performance. They were charming, attentive, complimentary, everything they'd never been before. Sophia asked about her opinions on fashion. Her mother wanted advice on household management. Aunt Marguerite praised her intelligence and grace. It was disorienting, like stepping into an alternate reality where her family had always valued her. But Isabella had learned to read the codes beneath the surface, and she could see the calculation in their eyes. The way they kept glancing at the expensive furnishings, the fine art, the obvious wealth. They were assessing, evaluating, preparing for something. And on the third morning, her father finally revealed what that something was. "Isabella," he said, pulling her aside after breakfast, "we need to discuss a rather delicate matter. The family estate is facing some financial difficulties, significant debts, and we were hoping that perhaps you might speak with the Duke about an investment." There it was, the secret agenda finally exposed. The mystery of their sudden affection solved in one simple sentence. Isabella felt something cold settle in her chest. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of grim confirmation. "You need money," she said flatly, and her father had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "It's a family matter," he hedged. "We're family, after all. We support each other." The irony was so thick she could taste it. For 19 years, she'd been a burden, an embarrassment, a problem they couldn't wait to unload. They'd compared her to Sophia at every opportunity, made her feel like her existence was an imposition, celebrated when they finally married her, off to what they thought was a desperate monster. But now she was family. Now they needed support. Now suddenly she mattered. Not because anything about her had changed, but because her utility had changed. She wasn't a worthless daughter anymore. She was a resource to be exploited. Isabella could have screamed, could have thrown them out immediately, let Nathaniel's guards escort them off the property with a dramatic flourish. But she didn't. Instead, she did something much worse. She told them the truth. She gathered them all in the drawing room, every single family member who'd traveled here with their hands out and their fake smiles plastered on. And she spoke calmly, clearly, without anger or tears or any of the emotion they could dismiss as dramatics. "You spent 19 years telling me I was worthless," she began, and several of them shifted uncomfortably. "That I was ugly, burdensome, an embarrassment to the family name. You compared me to Sophia constantly and made sure I knew I'd never measure up. You celebrated my wedding like you were finally getting rid of defective furniture. Do you remember that? Because I remember everything. And here's the worst part," Isabella continued, her voice steady despite the pain underlying every word. "I believed you. For years, I internalized every cruel word, every dismissive look, every sigh of disappointment. When Nathaniel told me I was intelligent and kind and worthy, I thought he was lying because I'd been so thoroughly convinced by all of you that those things couldn't possibly be true about me. You damaged me so completely that when someone good finally saw me, I couldn't even recognize it as real. She paused, looking around the room at their uncomfortable faces. "You're not here because you suddenly care about me. You're here because I'm useful now. When I was just Isabella, I wasn't worth your time. But Duchess Isabella? She's worth traveling for. She's worth fake compliments and manufactured affection. The conspiracy isn't that you treated me badly before. It's that you think I don't see through what you're doing now." Nathaniel, who'd been standing quietly by the window, stepped forward then. His presence shifted the energy in the room immediately, and when he spoke, his voice carried that particular edge of controlled fury that made people pay attention. "Regarding your request for financial assistance," he said, looking directly at Isabella's father, "it won't be happening. Not because Isabella couldn't ask. She could request anything from me, and I'd consider it seriously. But because she doesn't want to help you, and I respect that decision completely." He moved to stand beside Isabella, a united front. "You had 19 years to love this woman, to see her brilliance, her kindness, her strength. You chose neglect instead, chose cruelty, chose to make her believe she was less than human. And now that she's flourished, despite you, not because of you, you want to benefit from her success? That's not how this works." Aunt Marguerite, predictably, tried one last manipulation. She stood up, hand to her chest in offense, voice dripping with false hurt. "Isabella, you've always been so unforgiving, so resentful. Can't you let go of the past? We're family. Families forgive each other." And that's when Isabella felt something click into place. The final piece of understanding that had been eluding her. "Aunt Marguerite," she said quietly, "I have forgiven you. All of you. I forgave you because carrying that anger was poisoning me, and I chose to let it go for my own peace." She stood up, drawing herself to full height. "But forgiveness doesn't mean amnesia. I remember what you did. I remember how you made me feel. And forgiveness definitely doesn't mean giving you access to hurt me again or expecting me to prove my worth by being useful to you. You taught me that I didn't deserve love," Isabella continued, and her voice was getting stronger now, more certain. "That I had to earn basic respect through perfect behavior and constant self-erasure. It took me months to unlearn that poison, to start believing I was enough just as I am. And now you want me to prove my worth again? By being financially useful? By demonstrating that I'm a good daughter through material support?" She shook her head slowly. "No, I'm done proving things. To you, to anyone. I exist. I have value, and that value doesn't change based on whether you can see it or whether I'm useful to your purposes. You can accept that or not. It doesn't matter anymore. Your opinion of me is no longer the foundation of my self-worth." The silence that followed was absolute. Her mother was pale, unable to meet her eyes. Her father looked older suddenly, diminished. Sophia, for once, had nothing to say, and Aunt Marguerite's face had gone through shock to anger, to something that might have been shame, though Isabella doubted she was capable of genuine remorse. "I think it's time for you to leave," Nathaniel said firmly. Not a suggestion, but a command. "You're welcome to stay the night for travel safety, but tomorrow morning, we'll expect you to depart." Nobody argued. What could they say? The truth had been laid bare, all the hidden agendas exposed, and there was no recovering from that kind of honesty. They filed out quietly, the weight of their own cruelty finally visible even to them. After they left, Isabella stood at the window watching the last of the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Nathaniel came up behind her, not touching, just present. "You know that analogy about trees growing on cliffs?" she asked suddenly. In impossible conditions? Roots gripping stone? Wind constantly battering them? No proper soil? He nodded, and she continued. My family was that cliff. They gave me no nutrients, no support, nothing but harsh conditions. But I grew anyway. Twisted maybe, struggling definitely. But I grew. I survived. And now they want to rest in my shade? After never once watering my roots? She turned to face him finally, and there were tears in her eyes, but they weren't sad ones. They can't have that. They don't get to benefit from strength they tried to prevent. And Nathaniel smiled, that rare, full smile that transformed his face. No, he agreed softly. They don't. The final truth had been this. Her family's blindness was never about her inadequacy. It was about their inability to see value in anything that didn't serve them immediately. And understanding that, truly understanding it, was what finally set her free. Not from the past, because the past would always be part of her story, but from its power to define her present. She wasn't the unwanted daughter anymore. She wasn't even the vindicated duchess. She was just Isabella, complex and damaged and healing and strong, writing her own story for the first time in her life. And that story? It was just beginning. So here's what I need you to understand. Isabella's story isn't just about her. It's about every single person who's ever been told they weren't enough and believed it. It's about you, sitting there right now, carrying voices in your head that aren't even yours anymore. Those voices that tell you you're too much or not enough, that you should be grateful for scraps, that you need to prove your worth before you deserve basic human decency? Yeah, those aren't your voices. They're echoes of people who never learned to see clearly, and you've been letting them narrate your life like they have any authority to do so. The secret that Isabella discovered, the one that changed everything, is that you don't need permission to exist fully. You don't need validation from the people who hurt you. You just need to stop waiting for them to finally see what was always there. Now, I'm going to ask you some questions, and I need you to actually think about them instead of just skimming past. When was the last time you apologized for something that wasn't actually your fault? When was the last time you made yourself smaller, physically, emotionally, professionally, so someone else could feel bigger? When was the last time someone gave you a genuine compliment and you immediately deflected it, turned it into a joke, or explained it away? If you're doing any of these things, you're still living by the codes that someone else programmed into you. You're still playing a game where the rules were designed to make you lose. And the truly tragic part? You don't even need to play anymore. The only person keeping you in that game is you. Here's what nobody wants to tell you because it's uncomfortable and it requires you to do hard work. You can't blame your family, your ex, your childhood, or your circumstances forever. Yes, they hurt you. Yes, it was real damage. Yes, it wasn't fair. But at some point, and that point is right now, you have to decide whether you're going to stay broken or do the painful, exhausting work of reconstructing yourself. Isabella had to unlearn 19 years of poison. How many years are you carrying? And more importantly, what are you going to do about it? Because here's the revelation that'll either motivate you or make you angry. Every day you spend believing you're not enough is a day you're choosing their narrative over your own truth. Every moment you spend small and hidden and apologetic is a moment you're doing their work for them. So what's it going to be? Are you going to keep living like you need to earn the right to exist? Or are you going to start acting like someone who already has value? Because you do, whether anyone else recognizes it or not. Are you going to keep testing people to find your breaking point? Or are you going to start trusting that real love doesn't require perfect performance? Are you going to stay in that crooked house where everything's slanted? Or are you going to step out and realize that the world isn't actually built that way? You just got used to walking in a twisted way? The mystery of your own worth isn't actually a mystery. It's just been hidden under layers of other people's blindness. And you're the only one who can clear away those layers. I want you to do something practical right now. Not tomorrow, not when you feel ready, but right now. Write down 3 things you've been apologizing for that aren't actually problems. Maybe it's taking up space. Maybe it's having needs. Maybe it's existing in a body that doesn't match magazine covers. Write them down, and then, next to each one, write this. I'm done apologizing for this. That's it. That's your first step. Because change doesn't happen in some massive transformation moment. It happens in small, daily choices to stop accepting the unacceptable. It happens when you catch yourself shrinking and decide to take up space instead. It happens when the old voice says, "You're not enough," and you say back, "Actually, I am." Not loudly, not dramatically, just firmly, consistently, until the new voice becomes louder than the old one. And look, I'm not going to lie to you. This work is hard. Isabella had Nathaniel supporting her, but even with that support, she still had to do the internal work herself. Nobody could unlearn her worthlessness for her. Nobody could rebuild her foundation except her. And the same is true for you. You can have the best therapist, the most supportive partner, the most loving friends, but ultimately, you're the one who has to choose every single day to believe that you matter. You're the one who has to catch those automatic thoughts and challenge them. You're the one who has to sit with the discomfort of taking up space when everything in you is screaming to disappear. It's exhausting, it's painful, and it's absolutely necessary if you want to stop surviving and start actually living. Here's my challenge to you, and I mean this seriously. For the next week, every single time you catch yourself making yourself smaller, I want you to do the opposite. Someone interrupts you? Don't apologize and go quiet. Politely finish your thought. Someone asks what you want? Don't say, "I don't care," or "whatever's fine." Actually think about it and give a real answer. Someone compliments you? Don't deflect. Just say thank you and sit with the discomfort of accepting it. These tiny acts of rebellion against your own conditioning, they add up, they compound, and eventually they become your new normal. But you have to start. You have to take that first uncomfortable step of acting like someone who deserves to be seen, even when you don't fully believe it yet. The truth is, you already know what you need to do. You know which relationships are poisonous, which beliefs are holding you back, which versions of yourself you've been performing to keep other people comfortable. You know. The question isn't what to do, it's whether you're going to do it. Whether you're going to choose the hard, uncertain path of rebuilding yourself, or the familiar, painful path of staying small. And I can't make that choice for you. Nobody can. But I can tell you this. Isabella made that choice. She chose discomfort over familiarity. She chose truth over comfort. She chose herself, finally, after 19 years of choosing everyone else's opinions over her own reality. And if she could do it after that much damage, after that much time, after that much poison, you can too. The only question is, will you? So here's what I want you to do right now. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because we're going to keep diving into these uncomfortable truths. We're going to keep talking about the hidden codes that control your behavior, the concealed beliefs that sabotage your happiness, the conspiracies you've been running against yourself without even realizing it. This isn't surface-level content. This isn't just think positive garbage. This is the real work of unlearning. damage, and rebuilding from the foundation up. And if you're serious about changing your life, not just thinking about it, not just wishing for it, but actually doing the work, then you need to stay connected to this content. Because transformation doesn't happen in one video. It happens through consistent exposure to truth until that truth becomes louder than the lies you've been telling yourself. Are you ready to stop being the person other people made you into and start being who you actually are? Are you ready to stop apologizing for existing and start taking up the space you deserve? Are you ready to look at your life honestly and admit which parts need to be burned down before you can rebuild? Because if you're genuinely ready for that level of discomfort in service of growth, then hit that subscribe button right now. This is just the beginning. Isabella's story is one of thousands we're going to explore, and each one is going to show you a different angle of the same fundamental truth. You were never the problem. You just believed the wrong people. And now? Now it's time to believe something different, something true, something that actually serves you instead of destroying you. So what's it going to be? Are you in, or are you going to let another day pass where you stay small and hidden and convinced you're not enough? The choice, as always, is yours. Choose wisely.